All right. Hello. Welcome to yesterlore. I'm just finishing setting up some last minute things, making sure everything's in place for the stream here. Okay. Cool. Alrighty. So, we're going to get into things. Welcome back to the Old English rune poem. We are halfway-ish through the rune poem, I'd say. We're about where my page break is, at least. So I'd say we're about halfway. We have done... I keep forgetting to count before the stream. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. We have done 14 of the poems. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 more. So yeah, we are about halfway. We're going to pass that halfway point today. Sorry for the kind of late start today. I had to finish setting some things up and my computer decided to update today. It always chooses before a stream to decide to update. So that's what I had to deal with before starting the stream. So I still need to end at our typical end time at 8 p.m. Pacific. So I think it's possible we'll get through 3, maybe 4 of the rune poems today. I've planned for about 3 because we're going a little bit more slowly than I expected. Just talking a little bit more in depth about the specific words that are used and the controversy around a lot of the translation of these poems, because this isn't actually a very easy text to straightforwardly translate, because some of the issues with the dialect, the issue of the provenance of the text that we have. We don't have the original manuscript. We have a copy of ostensibly another copy of the manuscript because the manuscript was burnt in a fire. So we have not only sort of dialectal and temporal variation that make it not super standard in terms of spelling and some of the word choice used, but we also have potential errors in copying by the more closer to contemporary times scholar who wrote down the copy that we have, who maybe didn't have the same level of knowledge about medieval texts as we do now. Not that he had none, he was an Anglo-Saxonist, but we've learned a lot more through different methods of historical investigation, and maybe he didn't have those, and maybe he was unaware of things, or maybe just misread a difficult-to-read part of the manuscript, because as we've seen from looking at original manuscripts, it can be hard to make out certain letters sometimes. So just human error is compounded because we have a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. And as I've mentioned a few times, the Old English original itself was probably a copy. So lots of difficulty with that. And lots of enigma because of how it was copied about, you know, what names of the runes, if any, were included in the original manuscript. Do they match names of runes we find elsewhere? If Hicks was just assuming that, then he based what he wrote on that, but these do differ in some ways, at least in spelling, if not just complete different words in some places. And just a whole host of other sort of questions that we're left with when we're looking at this text. So it's been very interesting to talk about some of those difficulties and explain how this is not a straightforward set of poems at all. And we've been kind of treating them like riddles because of that, even if they weren't originally intended to be riddles. Some people think they were, but even if they weren't, they basically are to us, especially if you're not familiar with the runes, and these are newer Old English concepts to you, then we can treat them like riddles, because that's essentially what runologists are doing, is riddling these. So our first rune poem that we get to for today already has some scribal emendations that are typically suggested when doing editions of this poem. The manuscript that we get from Hicks, his copy, reads like this. So we have the rune, and then we have this name that we don't know if he provided or if he was in the manuscript, eolh-secg, and then it says seccard here. It's like S-E-C-C-A-R-D. And that is not a word that we are familiar with whatsoever. And also just kind of feels strange metrically if it's one word. So most people who edit this poem feel like this might have been either the original scribe's mistake or poor handwriting or difficult to read handwriting, and or Hicks's mistake in copying. But in either case, the emendation that's suggested is that this is two separate words, or maybe a compound, although the compound also just doesn't make grammatical sense if that is the case. It could. There are some arguments for why, and I'll talk about that when we get to translating. And that this should be read as the more standard, where's G here? Sorry, I can't type insular G. This seg ard should be ard here. Ard. Because ard is a word. And this seg here, there are some places where this like combination of letters that we usually pronounce j, so in some places it gets spelled with double Z, more like sitch. It could be, again, a dialect thing. But this is sort of the reading that you typically see when people like write modern editions of this Old English poem. Like when they write out the Old English text, they will typically just make this emendation. Almost everyone I've seen agrees that it is this. Whether or not they think it's a compound or not, there's a little bit more variation, but most people put a space here. At least we should read it as if there's a space, even if the scribe didn't intend there to be. We've talked about how weird spacing can be in Old English texts before. We've seen some examples of that. So we'll get back to the name of the rune, and I'll explain why there's a link here eventually, because we're gonna say we don't know the meaning here of the rune for now. And in this case, it's very accurate, kind of like with the last one, Perth. We actually are not sure about the meaning of this, so we'll have a discussion about what it means, and less of like a guessing what the answer of the riddle is in this case. We're just going to talk about the confusion and debate around this word. But first, let me go ahead and read it with that emendation. So, eolh-secg ard haveth oftust on fenna, wexeth on watura, wundath grimma, blode brenneth bearna yehuijna, thehim einia onfeng yedeth. So, I'm actually not going to translate this word either, and I will explain why when we get to the end. I'm just going to start with ard here, which pretty much everyone agrees is the word that's meant here. Ard is a word for earth or dwelling or place. It's just another word for earth. We've seen a couple words for earth in yesterlore so far. It's just one of the many words for earth. Specifically, usually it's like a generic word for like a place, a settlement, region, ard. And then we have haveth, which is has. We've seen this word a lot. Oftust, we've had this word before, maybe in a different spelling. oftest, most often. And then we have on fenna, in the fen, or the marsh. So whatever this thing is, either has a place, most often in the marsh, or the earth has whatever this is in the place or in the marsh. It's actually technically grammatically ambiguous. I've seen most people interpret it the former way and kind of take this plus the verb haveth as a sort of, not compound verb, but sort of phrasal idiom to have earth, to have a place, basically to dwell. So whatever this thing is dwells most often in the marsh, and I think that makes sense. But I think the reading of earth has it in the marsh makes equal sense. And it's just the ambiguity of the nominative and accusative case of ad is the same. It just because of the gender of the noun. It won't be different, whether it's the subject or the object, and because it's poetry, the order can vary, so we're kind of left to context in this case. And I believe sedge is masculine, so it wouldn't change. If it were the object, I think it would be the same. I could be wrong about that. I might be misremembering the gender of sedge here. Now, so in the marsh, whatever this thing is, most often dwells in the marsh. Wexeth on water. It waxes in water. It grows in water. Woundath grim. It wounds grimly. Leaves grievous wounds. Blode brenneth berna yeolh-secg. So here, blod, this is blood. Blod, this is a long O, so it becomes double O usually in modern English. Blod. It is in the dative here, and I think this is another example of like the dative that we treat as an adverb. So like bloodily. We could also translate it, I think I usually translate it as an instrumental or commutative, so like with blood. Brenneth, we've seen this word before. Burneth, burns. It burns with blood. Berna yeolh-secg. This is another instance of that formula that I've talked about many times before, where it's a genitive plural of a generic word for men or warriors. Here, bern, we saw meant something like noble, maybe related to baron, like B-A-R-O-N, and it's genitive plural, so it's like of nobles or among nobles, and then this word that means basically each. So with blood it burns each person, every person who touches it. Yeah, so it burns. Actually, I kind of got ahead of myself. I said who touches it. Yeah, any person, anyone, fe him aniye onfeng yedeth. Specifically, who the him here is the whatever this thing is. Anina, any, onfeng yedeth. Here, yedeth is like doeth unto. So whoever does any onfeng, and onfeng is taking up of something or picking it up, laying a hand. It's another way of saying like touching or grasping at. Whoever grabs this thing, it burns with blood. Basically, I guess it cuts into you. Whoever touches it. So, what is the meaning of this rune? This rune is, this is where we get into this sort of debate about what the heck this means. Often, people take this word sedge and the name of the rune that's given. It sometimes appears in other manuscripts as ilks or elks or elks or just eolh. Most of the time I see people write it eolh without the X. But the reason the X is here is because the postulation is that just based on where we see this rune used, it represents the x sound in Old English. So like any X that we might see, or CS combo here. Here it's more like an HS combo if we pronounce it eolh-secg, but that x isn't too distinct from x. So as to warrant its own rune. Oh, whoops, I didn't superscript that. There we go. But this is what he has written, Hicks has written on his manuscript. So In either case, the idea is that eolh, just by itself, eolh means elk, like the mammal. But sedge is a plant, and eolh-secg is a specific plant. That's what I actually linked to here. This is a picture of eolh-secg. It grows by the water, so that kind of fits the description. Now, I don't actually think it hurts particularly all that much if you grab it. So maybe this is like a particular kind of eolh-secg that you don't want to grab. I actually don't know a lot about the botany of this plant. I would like to do more research on it, because I do actually have a planned sort of paper that I want to write on this rune / poem in general, because it's very interesting. But that is generally the interpretation, that it's a plant, and that this sort of extended description of it grows in water, it wounds grimly with blood, it burns anyone who ticks it up. The idea might be that it either can hurt you or has some kind of protective power. Maybe there's some kind of association of protection with this plant in sort of herbalism. I'm not sure. I have not done sufficient research on that. But I would like to specifically look at, there's an, if I can find the link, I will link it in the YouTube upload of this stream. There is a dictionary of Old English herb vocabulary, and if I can find eolh-secg there, I will link it. So that is the most frequent interpretation of this poem, that it represents a plant, this plant, and it is often has some kind of connotation of protection, like don't touch it or you'll get hurt. And for that reason, a lot of neo-pagans will, heathens especially, will use this as sort of like a protective rune. Now, the shape is something to pay attention to, because this shape rune does appear in other contexts with a different meaning. Now, I said this appears as protection, and that it represents the x sound in Old English. Now, in the older Germanic language text that we have, this letter actually tends to represent the z sound, which doesn't really exist as a phoneme in Old English. That's what S makes between vowels, but it's not its own distinct sound in Old English. So it didn't need a letter anymore. So it was kind of recycled to be this x sound. But in like sort of Proto-Germanic or early Germanic texts that we have that are written in runes, and Proto-Norse texts that we have that are written in runes, and even into Old Norse texts where we have this rune appear, it represents z, or the r that comes from z, like this sort of z sound in like Viking Age Old Norse that just becomes a normal r in later Scandinavian languages and Icelandic. Now, the thing that happens, though, is that it ends up getting its name in the Old Norse rune poem. When we get to the Old Norse rune poems, the Old Norwegian and Old Icelandic rune poems, we'll see its name is actually cognate to this rune. This rune does not exist, like the corollary to this rune does not exist in the Old Norse runes, rune sets, but the name, eolh, in Old Norse it's pronounced yr, or yr. It exists. The name exists for this rune, still representing like the z or z or r sound. That's sort of transitional between z and r. And what happened is Guido von List, who I've mentioned before, I think when we were originally talking about runes, I might have. If I haven't, we'll talk about him extensively when we get into the Old Norse runes. He read sort of white nationalist meaning into the runes and into the poem Havamal, and basically made a whole different set of runes that are loosely based on the Old Norse rune sets and the Old English rune set. It actually looks a lot more like the Old English rune set, but with ones he made up and values he kind of made up. and meanings he completely made up. And his meaning for this rune, with the name in the Old Norse rune poem, was something about life. Now the shape here, in Old Norse, it gets flipped when it has the Z value. When it's not flipped, it's actually what replaces the letter that represents M that we haven't gotten to yet. It's this rune that gets written like this. So lots of confusion, lots of layers, like its name comes from this rune, but its shape ends up meaning this, and so you have to flip it over for it to be eid, basically. But this rune, spoilers, means man. It's spelled the same, so I hope that wasn't too much of a spoiler for a different yesterlore episode. We'll still have interesting things to talk about with that rune. Basically, he read this meaning of life into it, and that this was like the life rune, and that the flipped version is the death rune, which super not true. Oh, hello, chat. See, there's a couple people in chat. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. So Guido von List read these white nationalist meanings into this rune, based on the fact that the Old Norse rune has this rune's name, so he gave it that rune's name, and this rune's value in terms of the sound. And so Nazis would use this rune as what they called a life rune, and then flipped, they'd call it the death rune, even though flipped, that is just the Old Norse letter eid, represents the z or z sound. So you'll see it. I should have brought a picture. I kind of don't want to show like the white nationalist version of it on this stream. There are other streams that do that and explain sort of like the dog whistles to look out for. I can maybe link to a video about that as well in the YouTube upload of this, because that would be really useful. But there's this particular sort of style that they like to draw it in, to look out for. Similarly with this rune, when it shows up by itself, there's a particular style way of drawing it that you want to look out for, because you might be dealing with sort of a dog whistle there. By itself, usually in sort of rune, you'll see actually if you look in, sorry, I think I can close this now. That's the plant that this represents, the eolh-secg. You'll see the way that Hicks drew it is the way that it shows up in most sort of like manuscripts that we see it in, where it has more of this sort of round character, more like the Greek letter C, which a lot of people think it comes from, at least in its shape. Let's see if I can type it. Oh no, wrong. It's J. There we go. No, it's not J. It's C. There we go. This Greek letter, which I think I can write the capital one too. It's this. Yeah. So it often looks a little bit more like a psi, like a Greek letter psi. Psi, as a lot of people pronounce it now. And yeah, even in the rune stones that we looked at a few weeks ago when we were looking at Old Norse rune stones, it tends to have more of that round character, whereas the most of the sort of like neo-Nazi use of the symbol emphasizes the really like sort of angular version of it, which does appear in some rune stones, but especially just sort of like very boxy sort of style. It's pretty easy to recognize. And like I said, I'll link to a video that kind of goes more into depth about like the dog whistle, the rune dog whistles to look out for, that will go more into like that sort of style that you see it written in, and like when to be questioning versus when to like wonder are they just using the rune for historical reasons or whatever. So yeah, that is this rune, eolh-secg, probably that plant, having some kind of protective meaning either in herbalism or magic, perhaps, although that's a big guess there. But the poem at least is emphasizing that picking it up, it will wound you grimly. So we're going to move on to the next rune, and this one is a guessable one. I think it might be a little hard based on the focus of the poem to completely guess it, but it's one where we actually do have a very good idea of what this one means. So I am going to go ahead and read it in full in Old English, and then we'll translate. So, Siel se manum symbla bith on hichta, thonne hichina feriath over a fish's bath, oth he brimhengest bringeth to land. So, I actually made an emendation when I pronounced it that most people tend to do. They tend to see these two words as a compound. Now, say by itself can just mean like the, if it's masculine, and in the nominative case, like the subject. But this is not. This is in the dative case, so that doesn't really make sense. People think that this is a compound, semanum, and in this dialect, this appears to be equivalent to what's more standardly written as, I'll write it here, sa, or sa here. Sa means the sea, like S-E-A, sea, the water. And so a seaman is a sailor, a seaman. But it's in the dative plural case, so it's dative case plural. So two seamen, this thing, two sailors, simble, which means always, bith is on hichte. It is in hope. Most people just translate it as it is always a hope to them. But the on here makes it a little bit weird. We wouldn't necessarily expect this grammatically, but it could be made to make sense. It's always in hope, or a sign of hope, on hope. Thonne, which is when here. When he hina feriath over fish's bath. When they, he here is they, feriath, we'll skip over hina for now. Feriath, they journey, they fare, they journey, over, fish's bath. Bath here is another example where it's more typically bath. It's bath. It's the fish's bath, specifically. That is a kenning probably for the ocean. It's the bath of the fish bath. So when they journey him, this is him. When they journey him over the fish's bath, oth, and then usually we amend this as well to a space. He, they, again, brimhengest. We usually consider this a compound, brimhengest. This is actually another kenning. A brim is one of the many words for sea, ocean, and then hengest is a word for horse. Hengest, so brimhengest is sea horse, but it's another kenning, so it's not actually a seahorse like the animal. It is like a steed that you ride on the water. So this is actually a kenning for a boat. They, a sea steed, bringeth to land. This should, actually, never mind. Yeah, no. He brimhengest bringeth to land. They bring the sea steed to land. So it's possible that hina also refers to the sea steed here. When they journey him, or it, their boat, over fish's bath until, oth, actually I skipped over that, oth means until, they bring their boat to land, basically. So this thing is always a hope to sailors when they bring their ship to land over the fish's bath. And they bring it over the fish's bath until they bring their boat to land. This is maybe difficult to guess. I don't think the poem does a good job of like foreshadowing what this thing is. It's pronounced ciel. Ciel actually has two meanings, but there's one that is more probable here. But I'm going to give people a minute to guess, but I will say it is kind of difficult to guess, so don't feel bad if you can't guess it. And if you can't guess it, that's also okay. If there are any questions, I'm also willing to take those. But I'm going to go ahead and say what most people think this means. So ciel has two meanings. One of them is like, and it's a rarer interpretation, but one of them is that it means, not in this poem, but in general when we say the word ciel, it means something shining like a gem or something like that. But the much more common use of the word is that it means the sun. It's just another word for sun. Usually sun is sunna, sunna, S-U-N-N-E, sunna, and it is feminine. Ciel, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, is... Oh, actually, I might be mistaken. I'm not going to assert what gender it is. Part of my brain is telling me that it's grammatically masculine, but I'm going to double-check that because I'm not so sure. It could be neuter, or it could be feminine as well, by analogy with the other words for sun. Because most words for sun in Germanic languages are feminine, grammatically. I'm actually going to go ahead and check it. So it's the sun. So the sun is always in hope for sailors when they bring it, when they journey it over the fish's bath. If Hina here refers to the sun, then that would kind of confirm that that sun is masculine here. But it also doesn't make very much sense. They don't really bear the sun. So true, the sun is always in hope. Me when I see the sun. So true, yeah. But I'm still, waiting for my dictionary to load. I just want to double check what the gender is. But even if it is, it doesn't make that much sense unless this is meant to be like super mythological in some kind of sense, like ferrying the sun over the ocean. But then it says they bring their ship to land. That could still be gender dubious. Okay. Cognates are dubious as well. Some of them are feminine, but some people think that this is for the jewel meaning, which comes from Latin, which in Latin it's neuter, if I remember correctly. So I'm going to just check another source real quick. The sun. Gender uncertain. Okay, yeah, it's uncertain. But if Hina refers to the sun, then that would mean that at least in this poem it's masculine, which again would be uncharacteristic because the sun is usually feminine in Germanic languages and in Germanic mythologies. The sun is a goddess, basically, which is kind of the opposite of what we see in sort of Greek and Roman myths. But yeah, I don't think the interpretation of a jewel or like a brooch, which is another interpretation that this word has, like more of like jewelry meanings. I don't think that works. That works way less than sun here. The other sort of contributing factor to this that I haven't brought in is what the Norse rune poems say. The Icelandic and the Norwegian both have this as sol. Sol means sun, and that's just the Old Norse sun goddess. So, and just the word for sun. One of the words for sun. There is also cognatus in Old Norse, but it's not as common. So that is also kind of biasing the translation of it. Like, it's sun there, so why wouldn't it be sun here? So, yeah, it's probably the sun. There's little doubt about that, but what is kind of weird is the poem itself. It's always a hope to sailors. That makes a lot of sense. Sailors like to see the sun. It kind of guides them to land. They can know where east and west are. They can know, it's easier to sail it when it's good weather. You want to be able to see the sun during daytime. Of course, it's a little easier to sail at night when you can see the stars. And you can kind of navigate that way if you're using the stars to navigate. But the sort of literal interpretation is a little bit iffy here. I usually see translators kind of skip the hina when they're translating this poem. Or the on, in on hichta, they'll just say, it's always a hope for sailors, but it says on hichta with which would imply that I think hichta is in the dative case rather than the accusative, which we wouldn't even expect it to be accusative. We'd expect it to be nominative if it's the sun is a hope. We all see the sun, sailors aren't unique. That's very true. That would be another criticism I have of the poet. Hey, it's not just a hope to sailors. We all enjoy the sun, unless you don't. But yeah. So another note about, unfortunately, Nazi use of runes. The SS symbol is just two of these runes next to each other. So be careful of that. If you just see two of these, it's specifically this version of S, which isn't the only version of S we see. There's also one that looks more like a Greek sigma, capital sigma. It looks more like sort of angular, like a reverse 3. That's an older one that we see more in Elder Futhark, although we do see this one in Elder Futhark as well. This also appears in younger Futhark Old Norse text, this S as well. There's also what's called bookhand S, which I wish I had put on here. It's this letter here that we saw way like weeks ago, Cain. If you flip this vertically, so it's like a vertical line and then a diagonal line coming up, kind of like almost like this, but just with one sort of thing coming up here. That is what's called bookhand S sometimes. And that's another way to write S that we see in manuscripts of Old English. You can maybe see if you like flip the S horizontally, which we do see like different orientations for this S. If you flip it horizontally, you could see maybe how it can develop into sort of just a line with the like thing going up, as if you're kind of going like that. That orientation, though, is identical to this rune, what this rune ends up looking like in Old Norse. So in Old Norse, this flips vertically in the same way that I just described, but it still has the same reading of k, like this K sound. Whereas in Old English, when you see that, that's just a fancy way of writing this S, or like an alternative way of writing this S that we call bookhand. It mostly just appears in like ink manuscript runes. Whereas this appears in both manuscript runes and in carved runes that are sort of the more original medium for using runes. So that is this rune poem. That's something to look out for. Again, the double S here, standing for SS. That's another sort of symbol to watch out for. So here we have time for, I think, one more rune poem, which is perfect because that's what I planned for, is the 3 today. So this is Tyr. And this is another one where there's a little bit of debate about what this one means. So we don't have to do a guessing game for this one, but if you want to guess it as we're going, I totally invite that, or any questions you might have as we're going. So I'm going to go ahead and read this one. I don't think there's any like horribly wild manuscript emendation stuff to fix before I talk about this. I guess other than usually we expect a space here. Okay, my guess is sun again, sun 2. You know, you're not super far off from one of the theories, actually. Sun 2 revenges sun. You're actually not super far off. I'm not saying this means sun, though. It doesn't actually mean sun. I will tell you that. But you're not super far off. So, Tyr bith takna sum, haldes triwa well with athelingas a bith on farolde. Over nichta yenipu, navra switcheth. So I'm going to read that one more time. I think I might have put emphasis in the wrong place, or like spaces. I'm kind of following Hicks's dots here, which I don't think are original to the manuscript. Not because these dots don't appear in manuscripts, they do, we've seen them. But the frequency with which they're appearing here is very abnormal. I think Hicks might have put them where he thought the line breaks were. They don't actually follow the line breaks at all, most of the time. But there's a lot more here than I would ever expect to see in a manuscript. They're very rare in manuscripts. They're not rare in manuscripts to see, but they don't come up as frequently as, say, commas in modern English punctuation do. But they kind of feel more like commas to me, the way he's using them. So I suspect, can't know for sure because we don't have the manuscript, but I suspect they weren't in the manuscript and he put them where he thought they made sense. Maybe some of them are original. But yeah, Tyr bith takna sum, halde triwa well with athelingas, a bith on farolde, over nichte jenipu navra I think this is sweeketh. I don't think it's actually sweecheth. I would need to check that. I don't think this is a palatalized C here. I think it's sweeketh, because the verb is sweekan. Okay, so this thing, tir, is takna sum. It is one of, this is a genitive plural again, takna. So this is the word takn, which means token. It's where we get the word token from. So it is a certain token. Now, token in Old English has a bigger sort of range of meaning, but it usually means like a guide, something to guide you, a sign of some kind, which we do use token in that way. It's something to guide you, basically, a token. So this thing is a certain token. It's some token. When you see sum in Old English, it's where the word sum comes from in modern English, not S-U-M, but S-O-M-E. And it comes from an older word for the number one. In the plural, it gets used as the plural for one, which might not make sense from a mathematical standpoint, but it makes sense from a grammar standpoint. Basically, it's like an indefinite plural. Old English didn't have indefinite pronouns, per se, in the way that we have a or an. Old English didn't really have that. But when you use sum after a genitive plural, what that usually means is it is a particular instance of the genitive plural that you have before. So in the way that we say, oh, that's some person, when we emphasize some in that way, where we're kind of saying like they are quite a person, or they are a peculiar or important instance of that kind of person, that is sort of almost like a direct evolution of this use of sum here in Old English, where it's like, whatever this thing, it's quite a token. It is a certain token. That is at least my interpretation here, and I think I've seen others interpret it in a similar way. Some just take it as one. It is a token, but this kind of use of sum for a is really kind of admirable. It might just be there for the meter, though. But it haldeth trua well. It holds well, trua. True means like truth or faith. It holds like trust, faith. It's related to true in modern English, trua. It holds faith well with athelingus. And we've had the word athelingus. Sorry, I keep mispronouncing this because I see a thorn there, but it's a th sound. Athelingus. Atheling is a word for like a noble or a prince. So with nobles. But as we've seen, a lot of the time noble in poetry is just a poetic way to say people in general. It's kind of lofty language, so it doesn't necessarily mean someone who's part of the nobility. It could just be anyone. But it keeps faith well with nobles. Like I said, I don't agree with where he's breaking things up here. I suspect it's not original to the manuscript. It doesn't make any grammatical sense to put a pause there. And what does make sense is to put a pause here. A bithon farelda. So a is a way of saying ever. It is ever on farelda. And a fareld is like a path or a journey. It's always on its journey or its path. Over nichta yenipu. So yenipu means it's like a plural. Yenip is mist or fog, something misty or like shade, but usually it's mist. And so this is mists. Over the mists, and then it's nichta. And so this is of night. This is probably nicht in the genitive here. So it's nichta yenipu. It could also be genitive plural. I'm taking it as genitive singular. Mists of night. It could be mists of nights. It doesn't really change the fact that it's night. Nightly mist. Whether it's singular or plural, just given the the context doesn't make much of a difference. And it says navra sweeketh. Sweekon means to falter or to waver, like kind of fail to stand up. And navra is never, so it never wavers, it never fails. Never falters, more like. So this thing is a certain token. It holds faith well with nobles or with all. It is ever on its journey over the mists of night, and it never fails. Do we have any ideas what this could be? It is a certain token or a certain guide. It holds true with people. It's always on its journey over the mists of night, and it never fails. Never wavers, it doesn't move its position. You have ideas? I think this one is actually pretty guessable as to like the main theory that people have based on the poem. And then we can get into sort of like the issue with the name. I want to see if people have guesses with this one. Okay, so I will repeat it one more time. So this thing, whatever it is a certain token or a certain guide. It holds faith well, like it holds true with people. It is always on its path over the mists of night and never falters or never wavers. So it stays in its place. It's a sign or a token, holds true with everyone. It's always going on its path over the mists of night, and it never changes its position. I think the additional hint came from... Yes, okay, so the answer is most likely the North Star. Yeah, we got someone who is guessing that in the chat. So yeah, most people think that it is the North Star. Now, here's where we get into the issue here. This word tir does exist in other places, and it means glory or fame. So that may make us go, wait. Glory is a certain token. It holds true well with nobles. It's always on its path over the mists of night, and it never falters. Maybe it never falters, maybe it holds true, but usually it doesn't. Fame is usually fleeting. I mean, from maybe an ancient Germanic perspective, fame meant something a bit different. It meant a reputation that would outlast you. So in that sense, it does hold true if it gets passed down in legends, that kind of thing. But it is a token, I suppose, and it. But going over the mists of night is where people tend to get lost with that interpretation. And it never fails. It could fail sometimes. Maybe the North Star is named Glory. Yeah, so that is one idea people have, is that the North Star is named Glory. The other reason some people lean into the North Star, even knowing the meaning of this word, is the word token or sign, and the word fadeld both appear in a lot of writing about the zodiac. So that kind of lends to, these words have associations that have to do with stars, especially. So like this sort of diction here is pointing starwards, even if the sort of name does not. Now, here's where we actually bring additional context from the Old Norse rune poems again. Both Old Norse rune poems name this rune Tyr, which sounds a lot like Tyr, even though it's not a cognate. Tyr is a god. He is typically seen as like the war god, although his name etymologically comes from the root for sky in Proto-Indo-European. It's sort of cognate with Jupiter and Zeus, and Diauspitar, like the god of, like, basically all of the names that mean sky daddy, basically, are cognate. If you take out the father part, it's the word for sky. So sky god originally, who became a war god, maybe had an association with the North Star. Also, the holding true well. Tyr is the god of justice, so he's holding true. He's holding true. He's holding keeping faith well with nobles. That also kind of lends towards that interpretation of like maybe this deity is associated with the North Star. So we have some of his associations of like justice, keeping fast, but also the fact that the North Star is a reliable way of navigating. And then when we think about it, we also need to factor in that like who is writing this manuscript. Probably given the late date, it's likely a Christian who's writing this. And we talked about this a little bit with this poem, eolh-secg, here, where its meaning by itself, if we don't bring in Latin, and its cognates suggest a word that means pagan god, and specifically the god Woden. But with a like Latin word os, which means mouth, that interpretation equally works. It might be that the original name of this rune was Tiu, which is the Old English name for this god, but maybe we don't want to have a pagan god in our Christian manuscript, and we want to replace it with a word that sounds similar. It actually sounds even more similar to the Old Norse word, and we do know that there were, Norse-speaking people in England at this time, so they would have had maybe this word around, and so they might have heard like, this is the Norse name of this god. Maybe we're going to use that one. So maybe it is still the god, but in like a Norse spelling. So there are some different ideas that have been tossed around in philological circles, but people still tend to translate this as either fame or like glory, like you said. Maybe North Star, its name is glory, or as the god Tiu, that's just been sort of like censored or redacted and replaced with this word that doesn't make all that much sense in the context of the poem. It could be made to make sense, except for over mists of night. Maybe their fame overcomes the mists of night. You can make it work, maybe. But the idea that the god Tiu is associated with the North Star, there are potentially some other pieces of evidence to corroborate that. And if you just look at the words chosen and put it all together, it probably is talking about the North Star. If not the god, at least the North Star. So maybe this actually is, it could be a synonym, or sorry, not a synonym, what's the word? Homonym, or homophone for glory. Maybe there's just two words to it, one that means glory and one that's an obscure name of this star. Maybe unrelated to the god of justice, war, and from a long-range Indo-European sense, the sky. We can't know for sure, but those are the ideas behind this poem. And I think that's all we can get to today. Thank you, everyone who was able to be here. Thank you for staying. The recording will be up on YouTube shortly with the links to the things I mentioned. Next time, hopefully we'll get more than 3. This time I plan on doing 3 because I know I would be starting a little bit later because I wanted to go into some of the other stuff with these, like the white nationalist red flags to look out for with these. So I will link that video. I will link the Old English herb dictionary that might, if I can find a mention of eolh-secg in there, I will link that. If I can't, then I'll just link the dictionary and say I wasn't able to find it, but it's still an interesting resource. Next time we have Berk, which will be fun to talk about. I'm actually really excited for the next set of runes. So I think we'll get through 4 or maybe 5 next time. Right. Very pog poems. Thanks. Thanks. I'm really enjoying this. And it's lasting a lot longer than I thought it would. So that's not a bad thing. I'm enjoying doing this. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and I hope you have a good rest of your time zone. And farewell.